Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. We long to see the body of Christ look more like Jesus. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. Go to shiftingculturepodcast.com to interact or donate. And don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app to get notified when new episodes come out each Tuesday. And if you're thinking about it, go ahead and leave a rating and review of the show on your favorite podcast app. It would help us out tremendously. Previous guests on the show have included Onia Okawabi, Mark DeMaz, and JT Thomas. You could go back, listen to those episodes, and more. But today's guest is George Yancey. Dr. George Yancey is a professor of sociology at Baylor University. He has published several research articles on the topics of institutional racial diversity, racial identity, academic bias, and anti-Christian hostility. His latest book, Beyond Racial Division, a unifying alternative to colorblindness and anti-racism, is the subject of a lot of our conversation today. I got a lot of helpful steps out of this conversation, and I hope you do too. It's a really good one. I really enjoyed my conversation with George Yancey. So here he is. Enjoy. George, welcome to the podcast. It's exciting to have you on. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. I'd love to hear some of your journey with Jesus, and how does your relationship with Jesus inform some of your work and your writing?
Sure. I became a Christian in college, and so I grew up in the church, as most African Americans did, and became a Christian in college. I got discipled in mostly a white ministry. From that point on, I grew, and really, this is a little while ago where racial tensions were still, fairly high in our country, and so, so I dealt with racism. But I didn't want it to dominate my life.
Mm-hmm.
But this changed when I was in grad school, when I fell for a white woman, but her mom, who was not a Christian, her mom would not even meet with me, and so that sort of got me into thinking along the lines of, boy, this is a problem that really needs to be dealt with. As a Christian, I think I approach it from a different angle than a lot of others do.
Mm-hmm.
I approach, one way I would say it is, if you're approaching it from a more humanistic perspective, you understand the value of human beings, but you don't understand human depravity. As a Christian, I understand both. For a different reason, I see humans as incredibly valuable, but I also understand that human depravity is and that helps to shape my approach towards this.
Yeah, that's good. That's helpful. So as we start to frame this conversation, I'd love to hear where we're at right now in society, and if we don't really embrace what you're saying is this unifying alternative to colorblindness and anti-racism that you're trying to purport in your book, Beyond Racial Division. If we're not going to embrace that, what are some of the cycles that we're doomed to repeat if we're not going to try to get this unifying vision?
Well, you can think about it as, in our country, when it comes to talking about racial issues, there's two powerful forces. One represents colorblindness, which is, let's just ignore race. One represents anti-racism. You can look at D'Angelo and Kinde and Kinde and all that sort of work. And these are two powerful forces, and they're fighting against each other. And so one will temporarily get the upper hand, and they'll win for a while, and the other one will get the upper hand. And we just keep going around and around in a circle on this. So you'll have a racial incident, and the more anti-racism forces will protest that and fight against that. But then that dies down, and the more colorblind forces begin to counter-protest, and then we look at the school board elections.
Yeah.
Right now, a lot of times, a lot of the people who are more anti-racist are losing their seats. The people who are more advocate of colorblindness. But that's gonna come back around again.
Yeah.
So that we're just gonna stay fighting against each other until we figure out a proactive way of ending that fighting, and that's what I hope to offer.
Mm. And so what are some of those things to be able to end that fight? I know for me, if I'm really going after you, so George, say if we have an opposing viewpoint, and if we're looking at each other, I would see you as the problem because you have an opposing viewpoint to me. But if we're actually just turning our shoulders and looking at the problem itself, and both saying, hey, let's actually tackle the problem, and our different viewpoints and our varying ideas could actually help solve these. It's a better posture to take. We always have this fight mentality. How can we get a better posture so that we can help have better conversations?
Part of it is we have to make a commitment to it. And so we have to think about, well, why should I commit to that? And, here's the thing. If you're in the middle of the fight, so if we're continuing against each other, if I believe that I can win and put you down for good, I don't have to deal with you any longer, then my incentive is to try to do that. If I can, shut you up so that you can't have your ideas out, but only my ideas can be out there. If I think that that's what's going to happen, then I have an incentive. What I'm saying is that is not likely to happen in any time in the near future for either side.
Yeah.
You only think you're going to be able to shut them up for a little while, and you're only going to win temporary victories. So if I become convinced that is not a sustainable solution, now I have to start looking for a sustainable solution.
Yeah.
And sustainable solutions begin with, okay, let's stop fighting. What can we work to, because I want you to work with me on the solution instead of against me. One of the reasons why solution is not sustainable is you impose a solution and half the country's fighting against you. Eventually, they're going to be able to tear it down.
Yeah.
So what we want is to find solutions where we can work together rather than apart from one another.
I mean, that sounds like something in almost all facets of life, right? We're so polarized right now in America that we're just fighting on either side, but there is this majority of people that actually want to have some constructive conversation of how to move forward, and not just hear the shouting on both sides. What are some steps that we could take to have these constructive conversations?
So what I would suggest is, first we got to learn how to have these conversations. And so, in my book, I talk about, some of the steps, one of which is like active listening. So if I think about it this way. If you are in competition at work with someone else that you think you can beat down and eventually just take their job, then you may not care about listening to them that much. You may be able to just get ahead. But if you're in a relationship that you hope lasts the rest of your life, if you're married, you can win the fight today. That's going to cost you later on. And we all know this. Anyone who's been married more than 2 seconds knows that this is the reality.
Yeah.
So rather than win right then, I don't care, I'm talking about man, woman, whatever, rather than win right then, you're better off bringing that person along with you. And the only way you're going to do that is if you understand where they're coming from. And that's what active listening is. Active listening is listening for comprehension and understanding, not for argument. We get into debates where we listen for argument. So we listen to find the weak point so we can attack. Okay, in debate, that makes sense.
Yeah.
On an ongoing relationship, that doesn't. We need to listen so I understand where you're coming from, so that when I propose a solution, I take into consideration what your needs are. Likewise, if you're doing that with me, we'll actually begin to construct solutions that include more people in, are more sustainable, or buy-in. So active listening, effective communication, how can we communicate with one another in ways that others can hear us? Because there is research that shows that when people feel threatened by the communication, they literally cannot hear you.
Yeah.
They turn off. They're there. You're saying, well, the sound's going to their ears, but they're not hearing you. So I have to learn how to, and once again, marriage is another great opportunity. We learn over time what we can say to our spouse that works and what we can say to our spouse that does not work.
Yeah.
And if we're smart, we learn to say things that do work and avoid the things that don't work.
Mm.
All right.
Yeah.
And we know this. We know this is how you build relationships. We got to take some of those same steps here. I can learn how to talk to people who disagree with me in ways that they can actually hear me, not in ways where I can win the argument, gain Facebook points or something like that, but where they can actually hear me so we can work things out. So those are a couple of the mechanisms that we need to learn how to do across racial lines if we're going to have collaborative conversations.
Yeah. So in this racial conversation that we're having, to say, let's set up in a way where we all have dignity, hope, and we're setting up fairness for all people, and we're setting up equity. I think we need to have equitable treatments across the board. And to be able to do that, a lot of times what's happened in the past is we've had individual conversations with people of different colors, of different races, different ethnicities, and saying, hey, let's just hear our stories back and forth. But I think there needs to be something more tangible and practical that we could take something, a conversation, and actually move the ball forward a little bit. So do we do that individually? Do we do that in community? And how can we do that?
I think we need to do it in both. I think we need to learn as individuals how to have these better conversations, and then we need to address social structures and communities on how to have these conversations. I like what you said about, we hear each other's stories, which there's a role for that.
Yeah.
I need to understand other people's stories. But the reason why I like the term collaborative conversation is when we look at the definition, it's goal-oriented. So it's not merely hearing, as important as that is. Once again, I don't want to dismiss that or denigrate that. I want people to hear my story. I need to hear your stories. As important as that is, that's not enough. We have conversations that are going towards a goal, trying to solve a problem, and working together, building on each other's ideas to solve that problem. So that's a really key element that we can't neglect. Yeah.
And that's really, really important. I think that there, in these conversations, there's all sorts of power dynamics, privilege dynamics. We have unconscious biases that we all have, that we carry around, that we are not aware of, that we need to uncover. How can we take all of these different dynamics and strip some of those away so that we can be on equal footing as we're having goal-oriented conversations?
So, the way I see it is, if I am listening to you actively, and active listening, I have a responsibility to be able to put your ideas, your feelings in my words in a way that you understand it. So when I do my research, when I interview people, for example, one of the techniques I use is what I hear you saying is, and then I try to put it in my words, but their ideas. And when I can do that, then I can move on, because that tells me that I know basically where they're coming from. All right. So if we put that responsibility on ourselves, so it's not enough that I get in a conversation, I'll tell you my ideas. I must also understand your ideas. And now, is this going to eliminate bias completely? No. But what it forces me to do is not just focus in on what I want, but also to be concerned about what you want. And that does not mean that I have to give in to you. All right. Does not mean that I know what you want and I'll give it all to you. What does mean is, okay, it humanizes you, first off.
Yeah.
A lot of times when we have these groups that oppose us, we can make them, we could characterize them in inhuman terms. If I am trying to understand where you're coming from, so that's important, first off.
Yeah.
And now I have a responsibility to take that into consideration when I'm thinking about how our way forward.
Yeah.
All right. I know Joshua is thinking this way. Are there ways I can tweak what I want so that his needs can be met? And it should be in my interest that you feel your needs met, because then now you're going to help me with that.
Yeah.
So this is something that we should want to build on together. Unfortunately, too often we don't.
Yeah. And I mean, on both sides of this conversation, we all, this is the thing. I've done a lot of cross-cultural work in my life, and so I've worked with a lot of Arab Muslims Syrian refugees. And so people of cross cultures, we teach cross-cultural communication a lot, and seeing that everybody has dignity and worth and value. But oftentimes, we have, not just in race, but in all sorts of things. We have in groups and we have out groups, and we think that everybody who's not a part of our group, they're the enemy somehow. It just even subconsciously. We had a fundraiser just on Friday night. One of my friends invited an African American woman, and she heard where the fundraiser was taking place, which was a mostly white neighborhood, and she said, "Hey, am I going to be safe if I go there?" And a lot of my white friends, if she went into her predominantly African American neighborhood, was that, would I be safe going there? And we have these predetermined things in our head without having conversations. And we stay in our little boxes. We stay within our little groups. How could we start to cross-pollinate a little bit so that we could start to open our minds up that there is a bigger world out there, and that everybody actually has some worth from God, and that they are valuable to have these conversations with?
Yeah. So one of the things that's happened over the past several years is we've seen more and more interracial friendships developing. So, we're talking about 20, 30 years ago. Part of it would be, well, go make friends with people of different races. And a lot of people will go, okay, I need to do that. With the internet and with a lot of what we've done as far as being able to communicate across boundaries and such, there are a lot more interracial friends. So I think, there's exceptions, obviously.
Yeah.
But most people have some interracial friends. I think the key is, do you have those dangerous conversations with them? Understanding that happens after you develop a certain amount of friendship. You don't meet someone first off and then have you start conversations with them, obviously. Well, some people can, but I'm not one of those people. When I was in college, my best friend was a white guy. And I remember, we were close, we were like this. We played basketball together. We went to the Baptist Student Union together. So we talk about God, talk about sports, politics, girls, all that sort of stuff. Except I never talked about racial issues. I did not feel safe. I know that's the case because I had another friend who was not quite as close as me and him, but who's Hispanic. I talked about racial issues with, not my best friend, not the guy who's closer to me than him. Now, what is that saying about me? It's saying that what I'm saying is, I am not going to trust, even though you're my best friend, I'll tell you what the girls I had secret crushes on, we talk about the basketball game. I talk to you about God and, my victories and frustrations. I talk about everything, but I won't talk to you about my race. So that's on me. That's on me for having not broached the subject. I can't think of a time where I started the conversation and he shut me down. That was on me. So we have to be willing to risk the conversation with people that they've drawn closer to and see where it goes. Now, there will be times where that person's not ready for it. Okay. So this is not a magical, in my situation, I can't, maybe he would have shut me down. I didn't give him the chance to because of my own failings. There are times where people are not ready for that conversation. That's fine. You find someone who is. That's what we're going to have to do. We're going to have to risk in having a collaborative conversation and having a productive conversation with people. And knowing that, instead of approaching it that I got to convince this person my ideas, what if you approach it? I'm curious about what this person thinks about and why they think about that way. That's a different type of conversation. I don't have skin in the game whether or not they come to my ideas or not, but I'm trying to learn about them. That's a more healthy way of approaching how to have a better conversation with others rather than trying to convince them, no, you got to believe in this public policy that I so desperately believe in.
That's really helpful. That's really good. I think from the civil rights movement on to today, we've made some good strides. Martin Luther King Jr. Created some really good things, but now we're not really talking a lot about overt racism, but there is a lot of systemic problems for hundreds of years we've had a system that really disvalued African Americans. So how can we help people understand that there are still some strides that we need to make, that this conversation is not finished, it's not over. And of course, we know after the murder of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and others that there, of course, a lot of racial things blew up, and we started to have a conversation. But there are still people on both sides, African Americans, white people, say, hey, there's not really overt racism now. How can we have this conversation saying, hey, we need to do some more work?
Right. So here's how I like to sort of phrase that dilemma. All right. So I think there's two facts that few people will argue about as it concerns race. I think fact number one is that we have a history of racial abuse. I think that my most conservative friends do not deny that we've had a history of racial abuse.
Yep.
Everyone acknowledges that. Fact number two is that that abusive practices today is largely gone. So, if you want to talk about slavery metaphorically, that's one thing. There are not Black slaves in the United States today the way they were in the 1800s. That's just not true. Now, so this comes down to the question, all right, given this history of racial abuse, how do we create a fair society? All right, because this history of racial abuse obviously has had an impact into our society. You don't create a fair society by saying, okay, let's just outlaw slavery because slavery is outlawed. So what are we going to do? That's where the disagreement is. Some individuals say, well, we had a history of racial abuse. They agree. We don't have, the abusive situation today, so everything is okay now. Others will say we have the history of racial abuse. We don't have those same things today, but they have developed. Now, the evidence is that, what's happened historically impacts people of color today. We still have subtle forms of racism, although we don't have the sort of Jim Crow, or we don't have the internment centers or the reservations and that sort of stuff. We don't have to the same degree, obviously, but we still have. And there's a lot of evidence on that. And so if someone asks me, where's the overt racism today? I'm going to agree that we don't have the same sort of overt racism we used to have. I'm not going to try to make an argument that we're white supremacists and the Klan's running rapid all over everywhere.
Yeah.
I think that that's an unsustainable argument. It's a silly argument. It's not true. But what I would argue is, let's look at some research such as driving while Black. There's research that African Americans are more likely pulled over than whites, all other things being equal. We extend the criminal justice system. We can look at, incarceration rates. And I know people will come back and say, well, they commit more crimes. There's a controls people apply to that and still show that African Americans are more likely to be convicted and sent to jail for longer sentences, and Hispanic Americans too. We can look at evidence done by housing audits on how African Americans and Hispanic Americans are less likely to get a job, all of things being equal. We can look at the evidence in our medical healthcare system. There's a lot of research showing enduring racial disparate treatment in that. Look at the enduring effects of residential segregation and the factors behind that. So there's a lot of evidence out there showing that we don't have the same thing we had back then, but it's still through here today.
Yeah. Because
it's not over, we can't just pass a law getting rid of it. We have to figure out how to handle that. And that's where we have to have the conversation. So how do we deal with that? We have to hear from everyone on that conversation. Because we've got to find solutions for that that's sustainable, that brings people in, it doesn't exclude people.
Yeah.
And my criticism of some people who recognize these enduring effects is they say, here's our solution. If you don't take it, you're engaged in white supremacy or you're engaged in racism, stuff like that. That's not productive.
Yeah.
We got to have productive conversations rather than the sort of conversations we have been having.
Well, you just mentioned a lot of different systemic issues, and you just went down the line and went down the list, and a lot of those are interconnected. And so, is there some things? How do we actually engage in these collaborative conversations to have some constructive like change of systems on a
Yeah.
whole, because a lot of times we just put band-aids on things and say, hey, we're basically the emergency room in the hospital.
Right. Yeah.
We'll take care of it, but we're actually not taking care of all the symptoms of what
Right.
is happening and the causes of all of these issues. How do we step back to have those conversations and solve these things systemically?
Yeah. Maybe there is some policy or some issue we could just tackle, and it would just set off this cascading effect to all the other issues. That may exist. I've not found that.
Yeah.
So what I have concluded, and I could be wrong on this, and maybe someone will say, "Oh, have you thought about doing this?" And this will do that. I concluded that the best we can do is just one problem at a time. Because when you have a disagreement with people, try to solve it all at once, then you usually solve nothing.
Yeah.
So, what's a pressing problem at a given time for a given institution? And so maybe for a community, it's how, police community relations. Maybe for a school is how we're going to teach our kids about racial issues. Maybe for a church, it's about how we're going to change our service so that we could be more inclusive of people of other races and not drive off people who are already here. I think you have to deal with it one issue at a time at this point in time. Now, what I hope will happen is as we deal with these issues one at a time, we get better at it.
Yeah.
It makes it faster, more easier to deal with other issues. And if we do enough issues, then I think they are interconnected to a great degree. So if we are able to get better police community relations, where crime goes down, as well as occasions of police abuse, that's going to impact the economic situation of that neighborhood. It's not the only thing that's going to impact it, but one of the reasons why stores don't move into neighborhoods is they don't like the high crime.
Yeah,
understandable. So if crime goes down, then that reason goes out, and then you can bring some industries in the neighborhood. So I think by dealing with it, eventually we will have a more wide-ranging impact. But I think that I don't want people to get their hopes up saying, "Oh, we'll have this one conversation on this issue, and it's going to." is going to really solve the whole problem, because
yeah, it's way too massive. And if we can solve one problem at a time and do that, and not just really have Band-Aids at the very end, down line, but we're actually going upstream to say, hey, there's a bigger issue at hand. And so, and each problem, all sorts of different things come into play. And, there's family issues. There's issues of people not feeling like they belong somewhere. They feel seen. There's issues. There's all sorts of issues that we could tackle. And it's really a mess. But there is a way, which I love saying, okay, we're not dictating how we're going to move forward from one side or the other, but we're saying, hey, we both have some things to bring to the table. Let's sit down and actually bring all of our things to the table and see what is the best way to move forward together.
Yes.
And that's, I think, so fruitful and very helpful. How do we do that, within the church? We still have we're getting better having more multi-ethnic churches, but it's still a small percentage of churches. We still have probably more in the church than in society. We have different groups of churches. So in the church, how do we have this multi-ethnic conversation within a church to bring about diversity through the unity that we have in this with the same spirit?
Yeah, I think the last I heard is 12% of all churches are multiracial, which is up from about 7.5% about 20 years ago. So we are improving, but we could definitely do a better job. What I would say is we, the body of Christ, because I think that the solution I'm advocating has a biblical basis for it.
Yeah.
So we should be leading the way on having these conversations. If your church is not racially diverse, then maybe you can find other churches that are of a different race that are like-minded and wanting to have these honest conversations and engage with them. So that's one thing. I do think that thinking about how we can diversify our churches can be part of the solution. There's more research now on how we can be more successful in doing that than there has been in the past.
Hmm.
If you're a church, obviously if you're a church in some place like North Dakota, it's going to be very difficult.
Yeah.
But most of our churches are in urban or suburban areas where they do have access to multiple racial and ethnic groups, and so that is very plausible. And churches can think about that as one of their priorities, in order to engage in. And like I said, there's work out there, there's books out there that talk about how to do this. So I can go into that if you want, but there is some work out there on how to do this. And then as we bring in racial groups, that gives us an opportunity for those conversations. Mm-hmm. Once again, you can have friends of different races and not have the conversation like I did with my best friend. I didn't with my best friend.
Yeah.
So we can bring people in and then have those conversations. But if for some reason we are not positioned to become more diverse, or we want to have those conversations before we get diverse, we can look for churches within perhaps our denomination, churches that are like-minded in other ways, who also want to have this conversation, and then try to engage in it.
Hmm. Yeah, and I love one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is that, especially for us in the church, that our identity first and foremost should be in Christ, that we are all beloved children of God. And that should be our first identity. And so we could see all of us as children of God. And it should I think it should actually bring us to a place where we see each other as equals, as people coming from the same place, receiving the same grace, that we do have that human depravity, that we need God to help us. And we say, I'm going to come under that and be a child of God. We need to follow the example of Jesus and humble ourselves one to another. How do you see that identity issue? Is that key for us going forward so that we could have that unity together?
Yeah, I do think that my identity starts off with being a child of God. Doesn't mean I don't have other identities, but it's my core identity, and that can give us a basis for having commonalities across racial lines if we allow it to. And there is research that shows that when we identify with others, we have less bias and prejudice towards them. And so we start off with that. And, my theology also tells me that even those who do not identify with Christ, even those who are not part of the church, are also image bearers.
Yes.
So what that tells me is that, that I have to treat you as you're an image bearer, whether or not you agree with me on Christ or not. And that includes on racial issues. That includes that when I'm interacting with someone on racial issues, they too are an image bearer, just as much as I am. They may not have my understanding of salvation and that sort of thing, and maybe, and of course there's consequences to that. I acknowledge all that. But in this world, they're an image bearer, and they have that worth of an image bearer. So I think that should shape, so my identity in Christ, even when I'm dealing with someone who doesn't have that identity in Christ, should shape how I approach them, and the sort of respect I should be looking to give to them.
Yeah, and seeing people as image bearers is so important. One of the things I was thinking about earlier today is that ethnicity, I said, is God's beauty dispersed in human form. And we see a lot of the times we forget that, we actually see aspects of the beauty of God in different ethnicities and cultures than we don't see in our own. And so there's things that we're missing if we're not having these conversations, if we're not working together, if we're not saying we want to create this new life together to move forward. We're missing even aspects of God and the beauty of God that we could find in different cultures and people and places.
Yeah, I love being around people of different cultures, different racial groups, and different ethnicities. We're around Africans, because Africans are different from African Americans.
Yeah,
and there's so much I can learn from others when I'm open to it. And I don't think that I have to deny the value of my own ethnicity or my own culture. Yep. It's all right for me to say, I see them in that culture. That's not for me. And that's nothing sinful about that whatsoever.
Yep.
But a lot of times I learn from other cultures, and it's a beauty to that. And so, I think with the internet, more people are going to be exposed to that. But I think people who are not, they're really missing out on something.
Yeah. I'd love to get back and have you talk through a little bit why colorblindness is not complete and why anti-racism is not complete for us to move forward with a unifying racial conversation.
So, and I've already touched on this, colorblindness ignores the ongoing effect of race in our society. And so, as a person of color, when you are trying to deal with that, to have someone tell you, no, you don't have to deal with these problems. These problems are not real. Just doesn't work. It's not something that we can just accept and go on our merry way. Now, are there people of color colorblind? Yes, there are. So I'm not speaking for all people of color. I'm just saying that for a lot of us who've experienced racism and continue to experience racism, not Jim Crow type racism, but still racism today, to ignore that is simply not an option. And so it's not an option related to our experiences. So that's not going to work as an ongoing solution. Having said that, are there times where I am colorblind? Absolutely. When I'm grading my students' papers, I'm absolutely colorblind. When I used to play basketball, before I got too old for that, if the guy underneath the basket was white or black, I didn't care. He's on my team. He's just getting the ball. Yeah. And he needs to score. If he misses the bucket, I don't care if he's white or black. I'm chewing him out on the way back to the court.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying that there's not a place for colorblindness in our society at all. I'm saying as an overarching philosophy to deal with racism, it doesn't work. Now, anti-racism is a little bit more nuanced because people ask, what's anti-racism? To be against racism. Well, who's not against racism?
Yeah.
But when you read the literature on anti-racism, you realize it's not just that. I read a lot of the literature, the pop literature on anti-racism. It talks about being very proactive, that racism is multifaceted, and those are things that make a lot of sense. But the thing that I cannot get away from having read the literature on anti-racism, a lot of books, a lot of articles, and this comes up again and again and again, is that the role of whites is to do what people of color want them to do. Now, I'll just give you one example. You can find a lot of examples. And the most popular book was D'Angelo's book, White Fragility. I don't know if you read that book or not. In one section of the book, she talks about, how she was talking to a bunch of people of color. And she's implying, because she said, what whites can do. Whites cannot cry. Whites cannot argue. Whites cannot be silent. So whites can't do all these things. So she says to people of color, what if white people just listen to you and then promise to do better? So she implies that's the role of whites. Listen to people of color, promise to do better. Now, you're saying, well, that's just D'Angelo. Find me the anti-racism book that does not have, as one of its premises, the role of whites is to do what people of color want them to do. And let me read that book, because I'm betting that a white person is not allowed to object. That's a problem. That's a problem, because it assumes that people of color have all the answers. Now, I'm an African-American, obviously. And so, that'd be nice if I could say, hey, I have all the answers, but I know what human depravity means.
Yeah.
I know, I studied enough about confirmation bias to know what that means. It means that I am biased, and the answers I'm going to find are the answers going to serve me and my kind.
Yep.
That's just reality. And it's naive to think that under the right conditions that people of color would not abuse this power to whites, and in fact have abused this power under the right conditions against whites. So that's not going to be an answer. That's not going to be an answer. Once again, are there times where the principles of anti-racism matter to me? Yeah. I think it's really good for looking at problems and finding problems, but the answer just does not work. So both of those don't work, and they don't work for the same reason, because they're trying to impose a solution instead of working together to find a solution. And, when InterVarsity wanted, one of the names they offered, my book, was to be in between colorblindness and anti-racism. And I didn't like that, because it implies that my solution is this much colorblindness and this much anti-racism. My solution is qualitatively different.
Yeah.
My solution is we work together to find the solution. And if the solution we find is totally colorblind and everyone's agree with that, that's fine. If it's totally anti-racism, everyone agrees with that, that's fine.
Hmm.
But we work together to find the solution rather than have it dictated to us by others.
So you talk about collaborative conversations to do that. And you also talk about mutual accountability. And so what does that mutual accountability mean?
Yeah, I mean, basically, I try to use them interchangeably. Community accountability just means that we are all accountable to having a healthy conversation. And so we all are responsible. None of us can say, well, it's on you to do the conversation, but not me. That is out the door. Now, I just want to be very clear because I think sometimes people get misconstrued about this. It is not saying that the solution, everyone's going to have the exact same responsibility.
Right.
And in fact, my belief is that a lot of the times, probably not all the time, but a lot of the times in the solution, given our history of racial abuse, they were probably going to have whites doing more than people of color at this day and age. Now, I can't say that's going to be the solution all the time, or it should be the solution all the time. We still have to have the conversation, but that's my notion of what's likely to happen.
Yeah.
So the responsibility is not that we're going to wind up with the exact same responsibility, but going into the conversation, no one can say you're not allowed to talk, or no one can say I don't have to respect you. I don't have to say things in the ways that you can hear because I can treat you whatever. No one's allowed to do that as we have the conversation.
Once I started to engage in some of these things, one of the things that I had to fight was this thing where I didn't want to use my voice because I didn't want to use my power as a white male in the conversation to sway things. And so I actually stifled my voice in the midst of conversations. And I realized later that wasn't very helpful, that my voice actually matters and I don't just have to be silent. Is there a proper use or a better use of power within these conversations?
Yeah, as the power dynamics are going to be there. I think acknowledging them is very helpful, very good. First, acknowledge there's power dynamics. It changes from place to place. So a lot of times as a white male, you do have power. There are times where you don't. I guarantee you, when I was playing basketball, if you walked on the court, you would not have a whole lot of power until you can show that you can play like Dirk Nowitzki.
Yeah.
So I think acknowledging power is something that's a good place to start. But we have to be careful that the acknowledgement of power is not saying, therefore, this person can't say anything in this conversation. Because, if we get to that point, what we're saying is this group does not have stake in this conversation. Right. We don't have to hear from this group. And members of that group are going to pick up on that. And even if the people who are having a immediate conversation agree to it, other people are not going to agree to it. And now you're going to get the protests coming when you put out a solution and you didn't hear from this group.
Yeah.
So I think there is value in acknowledging the power.
It's good. If you could give some people one or two takeaways of what you want them to move forward, if there's these are the two practical things that we could do to get the ball moving forward.
Sure. Well, if I shamelessly plug, say buy my book first off. No, I say, think about the conversations you have with people you care about. Your spouse, your children, your good friends. And then think about how can you replicate that conversation on these issues with other people, which means that you're probably going to start with friends. All right. So you're not going to start with an acquaintance, and that's not fair to that person to all of a sudden put this sort of burden on them. Start with your friends. Say, you know what? I heard some of these ideas about having to have better conversations. I know we disagree on these racial issues. I'm going to talk about it in a way that's productive. So I got to understand where you're coming from. You can understand where I'm coming from. And maybe we can talk about it, and maybe we'll come to some agreement, maybe we don't. But I just think we just have to have a better conversation and see if you have some friends who will take you up on it. Not all of them will, but some of them may. I would not suggest doing this on social media. I suggest this is more one-on-one thing, or at least over the phone or something like that. So that's one thing. Also, to the degree that you have authority in organizations, in corporations, wherever you're at, I would suggest that you look at when racial issues come up, finding ways in which you can say, hey, rather than just trying to bring in some sort of expert and give us all the solutions, can we find someone perhaps who leads us in communication?
Hmm.
So we learn how to talk to one another and find solutions that way, rather than having a solution imposed, because imposed solutions tend to get backlash. So those are a couple of ways in which you might be able to incorporate some of what I'm talking about in your day-to-day life.
That's great. Well, I hope everybody goes out and actually puts those into practice. A couple of questions here I like to ask at the end. One, if you could go back to your 21-year-old self, what advice would you give?
Take more risk in relationships. Yeah. Especially romantic ones. I was pretty shy at 21 as far as romantic relationships. So I wish I had taken more risks at an earlier life in my life.
That's good. Yeah, looking back, I think I should have taken more risks in relationships as well. I think that's really good advice and helpful for people to follow. Anything you've been reading or watching lately you could recommend?
No, I've been really reading a lot of stuff for my quality of medicine class, and you probably don't want to read that sort of stuff. So I can't recommend that, and then people actually like me. It's funny that I don't like a lot of the TV today. I'm about to sound really old, and I apologize.
No,
and it's not like I'm going back to I Love Lucy, but the shows I'm watching are like about 6 or 7 years old.
Yeah.
Something like Burn Notice. I'm going back and saying, man, these are great characters. Everyone loves Raymond. I'm going back, man, this is great development.
Yep.
And I have a hard time watching shows today because I just don't feel. I know this makes me sound so old and old-fashioned. I just feel like the characters are developed just a bunch of action and or issues are thrown in your face or stuff like that. And I just want to see characters developed and then but yeah, so. But I can't recommend anything right now. So
well, that's all right. Hey, Burn Notice. Everybody loves Raymond. Hey, those are good things and really good shows that I really enjoyed. Great, George. How can people connect with you? How can people get your book and other things that you've written?
Yeah, so InterVarsity Press. You can go to their website. They have this book and other books I've written. Obviously, Amazon. You can get my book. If you want to contact me, you can either just, you can look me up. I work at Baylor University, Department of Sociology, or you can go to georgeyancey.com, and Yancey is Y-A-N-C-E-Y. And the E is important because there's actually a George Yancey without the E, and we're different people, and we have different ideas. I'll just leave it at that.
Well, that's good. It's like somebody trying to Google Joshua Johnson. You're going to get a lot of professional athletes, and you're going to get a lot of people all over the place. It's kind of nice. I'm on like page 35. So it's good. Well, George, it was a fantastic conversation. Thank you for having it. It's a needed conversation that we could actually move forward with collaborative conversations together, that we could actually see a unified human race, saying that we're moving forward together in racial issues, that we could actually start to uncover some of our unconscious biases that we have, so that we could have real conversations with one another. And I think that this is really profound and important. So thank you for your work. Thank you for the conversation.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to the show today. If you're really enjoying the show, please don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app. You could do it right now. Just hit that little plus. And then I would love it if you would leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. So you could go right now to the show and leave a star rating and review and let us know how you are enjoying the show. And find us on Facebook and Instagram. So if you want to connect, interact, I post a lot of quotes and different things that you could actually interact with the episodes and let me know how you are enjoying the show. If you feel inclined to donate, there is a support the show link in the show notes, and it would send you directly to a page where you could donate so that new episodes can be produced for your enjoyment. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have an incredible week.